Picture this. You've just finished a big project. It was a significant piece of work and it took weeks. It required judgment and real coordination, real problem solving, and you are proud of it. And now you have 5 minutes in a leadership meeting to share it. So you open it with, I just wanted to give a quick update on where we landed with the project. And then you watch, if you're paying attention, as the senior leaders in the room look at their phones, maybe start a little side conversation, or they nod politely. Well, they're clearly thinking about something else. Your work was excellent. Your update was not so much. And the gap between those two things, between the quality of the work and the quality of how it's communicated, it is costing professionals their advancement every single day. So, we're talking about how to position your work so that leadership notices. And it's not by inflating it, it's not by self promotion, that thing that nobody wants to do. What I'm talking about is learning to speak the specific language that senior leaders are listening for. Because it turns out that language is learnable, and most people simply don't know it. No one ever told them about it, they never learned it. So here's a way to think about the problem. Professionals and senior leaders are in many ways speaking two different languages. Professionals tend to speak the language of effort and activity. We completed the analysis. We ran the session. We delivered the report. This is the language of execution, and it is entirely appropriate at certain levels. Senior leaders, on the other hand, listen in the language of consequence and decision. They're always asking, what does this mean? What does this change? What do I need to do with this information? And if your update doesn't answer those questions quickly and clearly, their attention just moves on. You can't wait. Don't wait till the end of your presentation to do that. That's got to be early on. And the problem is not that professionals are bad communicators. It's not what we're saying at all. It's simply that they've been trained, and often implicitly trained, to report on the things, on the stuff, on the process. Whereas leadership is waiting to hear about the outcome, not the process. And those are genuinely different things. Bridging them requires a translation. And most professionals, they've never been shown how to make this. Most people just don't know it. George Miller was a cognitive psychologist at Princeton back in the 1950s, and he published a paper that would become one of the most cited in the history of psychology. And it started with a very simple observation. He'd been running a series of experiments trying to understand the limits of human attention. And he'd give people lists. He gave them lists of numbers, lists of tones, like sound tones, lists of categories. And then he would ask them to recall them or distinguish them. And across experiment after experiment, he found a pattern. It was a strange pattern. No matter what he tested, whether he was testing numbers or words or sounds or flavors, people could reliably hold about 7 things in their mind at once. Plus or minus 2, probably. 7 chunks. That was the ceiling. And he called this the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. And he argued that it wasn't a quirk of the experiments. It was a fundamental constraint of working memory. The human brain, under normal conditions, simply cannot process more than about 7 discrete pieces of information simultaneously before things start falling apart. Now, here's where it gets interesting for our purposes, because there's been research that's been done since then, building on Miller's work and looking specifically at organizational communication. And what they found is striking. In high stakes professional settings, like a leadership meeting, the number drops dramatically. And it's not because leaders aren't smart, taking in this information that you're presenting, for example, but because senior leaders in meetings are cognitively loaded. They're tracking multiple priorities and they're managing the room and they're anticipating decisions. So their available attention for any single update, it is not 7 chunks, it's closer to 3. Which means that every time a professional walks into a leadership meeting and shares 6 status updates and 4 background points and 2 caveats, They've already exceeded the cognitive budget of the room, and leadership quite literally cannot hold it all. So Miller's research wasn't about meetings, it was about memory, but the implication for how you communicate at work is profound. The person who can distill their work into three clear, consequential points is not just being concise, they are working with the architecture of human attention. And the person who cannot do that or just doesn't do that because they didn't think about it, they're working against it. They're working against that architecture of human attention. So, what does this mean? In practice, it means that the update that you give in a leadership meeting, it's not just a report, it is a competition for finite cognitive space. And the professionals who consistently win that competition are the ones who get known and get trusted and get promoted. And it's not because their work is better. It's because their communication is built for how leadership actually processes information. A client of mine put their heart and soul into a slide deck. They were building a comprehensive strategic analysis. They had 40 slides, deeply researched, very impressive, genuinely. And she sent it to leadership, to the team the night before the meeting. And of course, it was the night before the meeting. So you get to the meeting, nobody read it. The executive sponsor glanced at it and said, "Can you give us just the headline?" And she was not prepared for that question. She spent 4 minutes providing context that nobody had asked for. Her analysis was truly excellent. The communication, though, wasn't built for that room. And the opportunity that she would have had, the opportunity to be seen as a strategic thinker, which her analysis would have absolutely shown that she was a strategic thinker. That was lost. That was lost in the 40 slides, and it was lost in that question that she was very unprepared for. So, how do you build communication that's designed for how leadership actually listens? Let's walk through 4 specific practices that you can use, and these will make a difference for you. The first one is the single most impactful change that most professionals can make in how they communicate. And it's this. It's stop starting at the beginning. Start at the end. This is called bottom line upfront communication. So many organizations, my client companies call it BLUF, BLUF, bottom line upfront. And it runs completely counter to how most of us were trained to present information. In school, we were taught to build an argument. You lay out the context and you walk through the evidence, and then you arrive at the conclusion. And that structure works so well in an academic essay, for example. And it's almost always the wrong structure for a leadership meeting. Senior leaders, they don't want to follow your leadership. Think about that cognitive bandwidth, which is limited for them. They don't want to follow. They might not be able to follow your reasoning to your conclusion. They really need to hear, what is the conclusion? Give that first. And then you can back it up. Or then if it's interesting enough, they'll ask for more. They'll ask for your reasoning. Communication researchers at University of Southern California studied briefing patterns in high-stakes organizational settings. They found that executives made significantly more favorable assessments of presenters who opened with a clear finding or a clear recommendation before they provided the context. And I'm not saying they didn't provide context. We're talking about the order. They started with that clear finding or that clear recommendation, compared to presenters who built to the same conclusion chronologically. The content was identical. The sequencing was the only thing that was different. And the perception of content, well, the people who started with that finding or recommendation, they came out on top. Here's a very simple way to do it. It has 2 parts. 2-part structure. Part 1 is the headline. Give them one sentence that captures the most important thing. And then part 2 is the implication. Give them one sentence that tells leadership what it means or what it changes. So you could say, the pilot results are in, and we now have enough data to make the Q3 investment decision. That's it. It's 2 sentences. Everything else that you're going to give is supporting detail. And Either they'll ask for it if they want it, or if it's important and an important part of supporting what you're saying, yeah, you might then go through that briefly. The instinct is so hard to fight. The instinct is to just give lots of context before your headline, to really set it up thoroughly. And you want to resist that. The headline is what earns the context, earns you the right to share more context. The context, giving the context, does not necessarily earn the headline. That's our first piece. The second area is about currency. You know, every company, every organization has a currency, the thing that leadership is ultimately accountable for, and therefore they're perpetually focused on it. And it might be revenue, it might be growth, it might be retention, customer retention. It might be operational efficiency. Maybe it's risk reduction. Maybe it's competitive positioning. There's so many different things that might be the currency of your organization. And rising leaders make it their job to find out, to figure it out. What is leadership really focused on? And then they translate their work into that currency. I'm not talking about spinning. We're not talking about creating spin here. We're talking about genuine connection between what you do or what you've accomplished and then what the organization is trying to accomplish. So you make that connection, you make that translation. You don't make leadership do it for themselves. There's a concept in strategic communication, and it's called relevance framing, the practice of connecting your contribution explicitly to the priorities of your audience. And if you don't do it, if you're just talking about what you've brought and here's my contribution, you're only doing half the work. They have to do the rest of the work to figure out the relevance to them. Research from Wharton found that professionals who consistently framed their updates in terms of organizational priorities, not just functional activities, they were rated significantly more strategic by senior leaders who are evaluating them. They did the same work. It's just a different frame. So here's a practical exercise that you could do to work your way through this. Take any piece of work that you've recently completed and describe it at 3 levels. Level 1 is the activity. I conducted customer interviews. Level 2 would be the output of that activity. I produced a summary of customer pain points. And level 3 is the organizational implication. This gives us the insight we need to reduce churn in the segment that represents 40% of our revenue. Most professionals are comfortable and therefore communicate at level 1 or maybe level 2, the output. But that's not where senior leaders are hanging out. They're listening at level 3. So if you're coming in and you're reporting to them at level 1 and maybe level 2, you're not reporting to them in their language. Now they're having to flex that cognitive capacity, which they might be playing out of if they've been hearing other updates. They might not have that cognitive capacity. So now they're not flexing, and all they hear is something that's not relevant, not organizationally, not strategically relevant, because you didn't make it relevant. So your work is to build the bridge every time between what you did and why it matters to the business. And most people don't think that way. We're so busy running around getting our work done and then reporting on our work, we don't even think about the fact that we are making whoever that senior person is we're reporting to, we're making that person do the heavy lifting. Or worse yet, we are trusting that they will do the heavy lifting. But again, if they've already got an overloaded cognitive bandwidth, they're not going to do the heavy lifting. And you simply come off over and over as someone who's not strategic. So the good news is, once you start doing this and once you start practicing enough, it stops being a communication techniques. It actually starts changing how you think about your work. You begin to select projects differently. You prioritize differently. You ask different questions, and you certainly report out differently. And that whole shift in thinking, well, that's exactly what senior leadership looks like. The third area. This is one of the most underused and most powerful positioning moves. And it's telling leadership what you need from them, exactly what you need from them. Now, That sounds just too simple. It sounds kind of obvious, but people don't do it. Watch what actually happens in most leadership meetings. Someone presents a thorough update to senior leadership. They walk through the situation, they share the options, and then they stop and they wait. And the senior leaders who are so hoping to be guided to a clear ask, now they have to do the work of figuring out, okay, what's needed now? Why are we in the room here together? And that work, that moment, that confusion, that moment of, okay, so what do you need from us? That sends a message. It subtly positions you as someone who needs to be managed rather than someone who is managing. What they are dying to hear from you is exactly what you need from them. Research on decision quality from Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel laureate, research that he and his colleagues did found that decision making in organizations, it is significantly impaired, not by lack of information. We think it's all about information, but by lack of decision framing, the absence of a clear articulation of what choice is actually on the table. But when someone frames a decision clearly, here are the options, here are the trade offs, here is my recommendation, they don't just make the decision easier, they demonstrate the kind of structured thinking that senior leaders are looking for and that senior roles require. Now, there are really only three kinds of asks. If you've got an update coming up and you're going to be presenting to a senior leadership group, senior leadership team, and you think, okay, so what am I going to say to them that I need from them? Well, there's really only three types of questions. One type is a decision. Maybe it's, I need you to choose between these two paths by the end of the week. Two is an endorsement. I'm planning to move forward with X. I want to make sure you're aligned before I move forward with it. And three is awareness. I don't need any action. There's no action on your part that's needed. I want to give you this context in case it comes up. That's it. It's these three different questions, and you think about which one is appropriate here, and that you use in any given update. And you got to get comfortable with naming which one you need before you walk in. Every update fits into one of the three buckets. Name those at the start of your update. And then you've done something that most professionals never do. You have made it so easy for leadership to give you what you need. You have made their day. They are going to like you better than anyone else who is presenting to them that day because you served it up on a silver platter. You just made it so easy. People who make leadership's jobs easier, they get remembered and they get rewarded. The fourth area, when we think about how to position your work so leadership really notices it, the fourth area has to do with trade-offs. It's this thing that separates good communicators from people who are perceived as genuinely senior. And it's this practice of naming trade-offs. When someone presents a recommendation without acknowledging its downsides, two things happen. First, senior leaders, and think about it, senior leaders are paid to think about risk. They immediately start mentally cataloging all the things that could go wrong. And then second, they start, probably unconsciously, to trust you less if you're that person who only presented the upside. Because senior leaders know that any real decision, it involves trade-offs. And if you're not seeing them as the presenter, then either you're not thinking carefully enough or you're not being straight and direct and honest with them. When someone presents a recommendation and proactively names its limitations, this approach is faster, but it carries more execution risk. Here's how I would mitigate that. Then something very different happens. The senior leader's internal critic, it quiets down. They don't need to be critical of what you're saying because you already balanced it out. You talked about the upside and the downside. You've done that job for them. And so the trust that creates is significant. You're starting to think and sound like them. And that makes a real difference over the course of a career if you're doing that regularly. There's research on persuasion and credibility. Psychologist William McGuire did this research that found that two-sided arguments, the ones that acknowledge the counterpoints before making the case, they are consistently rated as more credible and more persuasive than one-sided arguments presenting only supporting evidence. And this effect is amplified in audiences who are already skeptical. So the skeptics, or the people who have high domain knowledge, so they really know what's going on. And so that may also drive some skepticism. When you bring in that other side, it really grabs their attention. And it causes them to think, oh, this person, this is worth listening to. They're not coming in here bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and not having considered all the angles. One of my clients, Trevor, was preparing he was going to present a build versus buy recommendation to his company's executive team. And of course, his instinct was to just make this glowing recommendation for what he wanted to move forward, what he wanted them to agree to. And he just wanted to make that really strong recommendation to come in confident and clean and persuasive. And we worked on this in light of this principle. So instead of bringing in a case for one option, he walked in with a very clear-eyed view without going on and on. He gave this clear-eyed view of both options. He talked about the build option's strategic upside and its 18-month risk window. And then he talked about the buy option's speed and the long-term flexibility cost. And his recommendation then was clear, but so were the trade-offs. And then after the meeting, the CFO, of course, who's always looking for risk, pulled him aside and said, "That was one of the clearest presentations I've seen in a long time. You thought about this the way we think about it." And that is the biggest win there is. That sentence, "You thought about this the way we think about it," that's the highest form of praise. That's the highest form of positioning. It means the gap between where you are and where you want to be just got a whole lot smaller in someone else's mind. And when that someone else is a senior executive, you've just done something really smart. I had another client, Simone. She was a senior manager. She worked in a consumer goods company. She's smart. She's hardworking. She's very well regarded. But she'd been in the same role, been 3 years, and she didn't know, why are the promotions not coming? Why are when I bring up promotion, that conversation just doesn't progress. So we dug into what was going on. And when I dug into her communication, the issue became clear, like almost immediately. She was very thorough, and sometimes she was heroically thorough. Her updates were comprehensive. She covered all her bases. She was so organized, and she was detailed. And her updates were, almost without exception, too long, too contextual, too much detail about what she did and the work that had been done rather than what it meant. So that's where we worked. We worked on a reframe here. Before any significant update, whether it was a written update, whether it was a verbal update, she would answer 3 questions first. She would answer, what's the one thing that leadership most needs to know? And second question, what does it change, or what does it enable? And then the third question, what, if anything, do I need from them? And those 3 questions would be her filter. And any information that she was dying to share but did not pass through that filter, it got cut. And it's not because it wasn't true. It's just that it wasn't serving the communication and the people who needed to know what it was she had to share. So the first time she used this approach in a leadership meeting, besides being very uncomfortable in her preparation, but she stuck to her guns. And in the past, her updates had taken about 12 minutes. And this time, it took 4 minutes. And she told me the room was more engaged. And afterward, her VP said something that when she shared with me, she couldn't believe it. She said, "Simone, you've gotten really sharp lately." Now, of course, she hadn't gotten sharper. Her words had gotten sharper. Her update had gotten sharper. She was just as sharp. But in leadership's perception, those things are the same. You and your communication, they're the same. So I want to leave you with this. Positioning your work, it's not about marketing yourself. It's about respecting the attention of the people that you're communicating with. Senior leaders have limited cognitive bandwidth, and so many really big, enormous competing priorities. The professional who walks in with a clear headline, a connection to what matters, an explicit ask, and an honest view of the trade offs. That person, it's not just communicating well, they are demonstrating the judgment and the clarity and the consideration for others that senior roles require and that senior leaders are looking for. The work speaks for itself only when the communication lets it. Work doesn't speak for itself all by itself. You need the right kind of communication. And communication, unlike raw talent, is completely within your control. So, here is an assignment if you choose to take this. And let's get specific. Before your next real update, significant update, maybe it's an email, maybe it's a meeting presentation, maybe it's a status update in a call, run it through this filter. One, what is the single headline? Can I say it in one sentence? And then two, what does it mean for the business or the decision at hand? And then three, what do I need from the people receiving this? Do I need a decision? Do I need an endorsement? Or is this just for awareness? That's it. 3 questions, 30 seconds of preparation. And bonus, if you want to go one level further, add the trade-off. What's the risk or the downside of your recommendation, and how are you thinking about it? Practice this. Practice it once and notice how the room responds differently, not because your work changed, but because your communication was finally built for the people receiving it.